All right, today we are diving deep into one of the most legendary stories of the sea, the mutiny on the HMS Bounty. Now, this is a tale of betrayal, it's a tale of unbelievable survival, and it's a story of how a supposed paradise turned into an absolute prison. And I'll tell you right now, forget everything you think you know from the movies. The real story is so much more complicated and way more dramatic. And it all kicks off in the dead of night, in one man's cabin.
So let's start right here, with the words of Lieutenant William Bligh himself. Just try to imagine this for a second. You are the commander of a British naval ship. You are literally thousands of miles from home, asleep. And suddenly, your cabin door just bursts open. But here's the thing. It's not an enemy boarding party. It's your own men. And they're being led by the very man you mentored. They're there to take your ship, and maybe your life. This single, terrifying moment, well, it's the spark that ignites the whole story.
So, how on earth did it get to this point? I mean, how does a respected naval commander end up tied up and threatened by his own crew? Well, to really understand the explosion, you've got to understand the slow-burning fuse that led up to it. And it all began with a mission that, on the surface at least, seemed pretty innocent. So this was the whole point of the HMS Bounty's voyage. The idea, which came from the famous botanist Sir Joseph Banks, was to go to Tahiti, collect 1,000 or so breadfruit plants, which is this starchy, high-energy food, and then transplant them in the British West Indies. The goal? To create a super cheap, sustainable food source to feed the huge enslaved populations working on the sugar plantations. So, you see, it was supposed to be a botanical mission, an economic project. Nobody was expecting the kind of violence that would make this voyage infamous. Now, at the very heart of this drama are two men. On one side, you have Lieutenant William Bligh. He's 33, an absolutely brilliant navigator who'd actually sailed with the legendary Captain Cook. And from Cook, he learned how to be a master seaman, but he also learned how to command through fear, with a notoriously short temper and a tongue that could cut a man down. And on the other side, Fletcher Christian. He's a decade younger, ambitious, well-educated, and he was Bligh's hand-picked protege. Before this voyage, these two were friends. It was a real mentor and student relationship, which just makes what happens next all the more tragic. The pressure on these guys was immense from the get-go, starting with the ship itself. See, the Bounty wasn't some grand warship. She was a tiny coastal trader, just 91 feet long, and they had to cram 45 men into this thing for a journey that was supposed to last 2 years. To make things even worse, a huge part of their already tiny living space was turned into a floating greenhouse for all those breadfruit plants. And here's the real kicker, a fatal flaw in the plan: there were no Royal Marines on board. On a voyage this long, Marines were the captain's muscle, his enforcers. Without them, Bligh had no real armed backup to keep order. This ship was a pressure cooker waiting to blow.
The journey to Tahiti was long and incredibly difficult. They actually failed to get around the treacherous Cape Horn, so they had to go the long way around Africa. And by then, tensions between Bligh and his officers were already starting to boil over. But it was their destination, the seemingly perfect island of Tahiti, that would be the place where everything truly fell apart. Think about this. They were stuck in Tahiti for 6 months, just waiting for the breadfruit to be mature enough to transport. So for half a year, these sailors, men used to the brutal discipline and filth of the Royal Navy, were basically let loose in what they considered paradise on earth. And the contrast was just intoxicating. The Tahitian way of life seemed so easy, so beautiful, so free. It was the exact opposite of naval life. And maybe Bligh gave them too much freedom, because the men started to forget what it even meant to be sailors anymore. The breakdown of discipline was obvious. It didn't just bend, it completely shattered. The crew got lazy, they formed deep, personal relationships on the island. Fletcher Christian, the second-in-command, embraced this new life more than anyone. He got so many tattoos, he basically could have passed for a local. But the biggest red flag, 3 men actually deserted the ship. Now, they were caught, but the message was crystal clear. For some of these guys, the thought of going back to that ship and that life was just unbearable. Paradise had become poison to naval order. The final straw, the thing that broke the camel's back, happened right after they finally left Tahiti. The tension on that ship was so thick you could cut it with a knife. And on the evening of April 27th, Bligh flies into a rage because some coconuts from his private stash are missing. And what happened next wasn't the reaction of a leader, it was a full-blown tantrum. He lined up his officers and accused them all of being thieves, focusing his fury right on Fletcher Christian. In front of the entire crew, Bligh called him a scoundrel, a dog. It was a complete and utter public humiliation over a handful of coconuts. For Fletcher Christian, that was it.
That public shaming was the breaking point. His honor as an officer, as a gentleman, had just been destroyed by the very man who was supposed to be his mentor. And that night, as he stewed in that humiliation, a new, desperate plan started to take shape in his mind. You know, Christian's first thought was to desert. He was actually going to build a little raft and just cast himself off into the ocean, figuring he'd rather die at sea than suffer one more day of Bligh's abuse. But then another officer mentioned that the crew was, quote, ripe for anything. And a different thought began to take root in Christian's mind. The humiliation turned into rage. Why should he be the one to leave? Why shouldn't Bligh be the one to go? It was a crazy idea, it was treason, punishable by a gruesome death, but in that moment of pure fury, it made perfect sense.
The whole thing came together with terrifying speed. Christian got the men on his watch on his side. First, they quietly took over the ship's arms chest, handing out cutlasses and muskets. Next, they stormed Bligh's cabin. The captain was caught completely off guard, still asleep. Once they had him, the mutineers ordered the ship's largest boat, a 23-foot launch, to be lowered into the sea. This was it. They were casting Bligh and anyone loyal to him adrift. There was no turning back now.
So, just hours after that ridiculous argument over coconuts, William Bligh, the commander of His Majesty's ship Bounty, was forced over the side of his own ship wearing nothing but his nightshirt. With him were 18 men who had remained loyal, all of them crammed into a small, open boat. They were now in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from any European settlement, with barely any food or water and almost no hope of survival. The mutiny itself was, shockingly, bloodless, but the real story was just getting started.
And right here, the story splits in two. While Fletcher Christian and the mutineers sailed off into the sunrise, looking for a place to hide, Bligh and his men were facing what looked like certain death. But here's the thing. For all his failings as a people manager, Bligh was about to prove why he was considered one of the greatest navigators of his time. This would become his finest and his most terrible hour.
Just look at that number, 3,618 miles. That is the distance Bligh had to navigate in an open boat to get from where the mutiny happened to the nearest friendly port, a Dutch settlement in Timor. To put that in perspective, that's like sailing from Los Angeles to New York and then some. And he did it with no real charts, just what he could remember, a sextant and a watch. It is to this day one of the most incredible feats of navigation in all of maritime history. Can you even picture the conditions? The little boat was so overloaded with 19 men that the sides were just a few inches above the waterline. Any decent-sized wave could have swamped them. And to make the journey, Bligh had to enforce the most brutal rationing. Every man got 1 ounce of bread. That's about the weight of a slice of sandwich bread, and a quarter pint of water per day. That's it. It was a starvation diet, but it was the only way they had a chance.
And you don't have to take my word for it. Bligh's own log from the journey paints a miserable picture. He wrote that they could never stretch out, they could never get dry, the sun baked them during the day, and then the cold, wet nights left their bodies so stiff and cramped with pain they could barely move. Sleep wasn't a relief, it was just a few hours of shivering before another day of suffering.
Their hunger was primal. At one point, a small seabird actually landed on the boat, and they managed to catch it with their bare hands. Bligh, with absolute fairness, divided that tiny bird, guts, feathers, everything, into 18 equal portions, and the men devoured them, raw bones and all, as Bligh wrote, using the salt water as sauce. That's how desperate they were.
On top of the starvation, they were completely at the mercy of the ocean. Storms would roll in and threaten to just swallow their tiny boat whole. Bligh wrote they were in a constant state of horror and anxiety, just bailing water for their lives. He even admitted in his log that he started to fear his men were just too weak to survive another storm. And yet, somehow, they did. After 45 agonizing days, Bligh and his surviving men did the impossible. They made it to Timor. It was an absolute miracle. But that's only half the story. What about Fletcher Christian and the mutineers? They had the ship, they had their freedom, they had the paradise they were willing to kill for. Their story, however, was about to take a much, much darker turn. The fates of these two groups just could not have been more different. Bligh eventually made it back to England. He was hailed as a hero. The mutineers, on the other hand, became the most wanted men in the British Empire. The ones who decided to stay in Tahiti were eventually captured by the Navy, taken back to England for trial, and 3 of them were hanged. But Fletcher Christian and his inner circle, they vanished. They found the perfect hiding place, a remote little island called Pitcairn, which was actually misplaced on all the naval charts, and there they burned the bounty, cutting off their last link to the outside world forever.
But the paradise they dreamed of building on Pitcairn, it never happened. Instead, their little utopia became a pressure cooker of jealousy, alcoholism, and violence. The English mutineers treated the Tahitian men they brought with them like slaves, which led to constant fights over land and women. And within just a few years, the whole settlement just exploded. The Tahitian men rose up and murdered Fletcher Christian and 4 other mutineers. And then, in revenge, the widows of the mutineers murdered all the remaining Tahitian men. It was just this horrifying cycle of slaughter that left almost all the men dead. The paradise they'd mutinied for had become their own personal hell.
And so after all that, we are left with the exact same question that has fascinated people for over 200 years. Who was really to blame here? Was William Bligh the sadistic tyrant from the movies, a man whose constant abuse made mutiny the only option? Or was he a peerless, brilliant seaman who was brought down by an emotional, hot-headed subordinate who just couldn't handle real naval discipline after tasting the easy life in Tahiti? The truth, as it usually is probably somewhere in the messy middle. A deeply flawed commander and a deeply flawed subordinate, trapped together on a tiny ship on a fateful voyage that created a story for the ages.